The eggs cost $6.89. I remember that number the way you remember the license plate of the car that hit you. It was a Tuesday, a little after 8 in the morning, and I was standing at the self-checkout at Fairview Market with a carton of eggs, a bag of coffee, and a loaf of bread, and my card just didn't work. Insufficient funds, the little screen said, calm as anything, like it hadn't just rearranged the furniture of my entire life. I tried it twice. A teenage boy stocking the shelf near the register glanced over, then looked away fast, the way people do when they don't want to embarrass you, but can't help noticing anyway. I called Walt, my husband, 19 years married, and before that, 4 years of dating slow enough that neither of us ever had to rush into anything we weren't sure about. He picked up on the third ring, and I could hear the television going in the background, some morning show host laughing about nothing. "Hey," I said. "Something's wrong with the card. It got declined." There was a pause, and then he laughed. Not confused, amused. "Yeah," he said. "We talked about that." "Talked about what?" "Bree and I think you've been spending too freely since I retired. We're just tightening things up a little." I stood there in the cereal aisle with a phone against my ear and a stranger's grocery cart squeaking past me, and I genuinely could not process the sentence. Tightening things up. Like I was a budget line, not his wife. "Walt, I'm buying eggs. It adds up, Dee." Before I could answer, I heard the phone shift hands, that particular rustle of fabric against a speaker, and then Bree's voice came on, smooth and patient like she was talking to a child who'd wandered off in a department store. "Diane," she said, not Dee, never Dee. She always used my full name like a correction. "Going forward, we just ask that you check with Dad before making purchases. That's all. Nothing crazy." I actually laughed, one short, disbelieving breath of a laugh. "Check with your father. Before I buy groceries. It's just for a little while," she said, "while things get sorted out." "What things, Bri? You know what things." I did not know what things. That was the part that unsettled me most. Not the accusation, but the certainty behind it, like she'd rehearsed this moment long before I'd ever walked into that store. I told her, quietly, that I would just put the eggs back, and I did. I left the coffee and the bread on the little side shelf they keep for abandoned items, and I walked out to my car and sat there for a full minute without turning the key, watching my own breath fog up slightly in the cold morning air, thinking, this cannot actually be happening over $6.89. It wasn't, of course. It never is. The eggs were never the point. They were just the first crack wide enough for me to finally see through. Lied on Nani see. To understand how we got there, you have to understand who Walt used to be, and who I was to him. I spent 29 years managing budgets for the Maple Ridge School District. Payroll, vendor contracts, capital improvement funds, the kind of work that teaches you to notice when numbers don't add up before anyone else does. I am, by nature and by training, a careful person. I don't buy things on impulse. I've driven the same reliable sedan for 11 years. My idea of splurging is a nicer bottle of wine on a Friday. Walt was a contractor, and a good one. The kind of man who could walk through an unfinished house and see exactly what it would become. People in Maple Ridge called him when something needed fixing, and for 30 years, something always did. He liked being needed. He liked being the one with the answer. We married when I was 40, and he was 43, both of us having already lived full lives before we met. He'd been widowed, I'd been divorced, and there was something steady and unromantic and wonderful about the way we fit together. He handled the physical world, I handled the numbers. It worked, for a long, long time. Then, 6 years ago, 2 of his biggest commercial clients stopped paying him. One went bankrupt outright. The other tied him up in a payment dispute that dragged on for the better part of a year. Between unpaid invoices, a line of credit he'd leaned on to keep his crews employed, and back taxes that had quietly piled up while he was trying to hold everything together, Walt found himself close to $98,000 in debt. He didn't tell me how bad it was until I found him sitting in the garage one night with the lights off, just sitting, staring at nothing. "I can't fix this one," he said. It was the only time in 19 years I ever heard him say those words. So I fixed it. Not because he asked, he never asked, but because I loved him, and because I could. I pulled from an investment account I'd built over decades. I refinanced a portion of the house I'd owned outright since before we married. I negotiated with his creditors myself, using every scrap of patience 29 years in budget meetings had taught me. We paid the IRS first, then his suppliers, then quietly closed out the line of credit at a reduced settlement. I never told anyone, not my sister, not our friends, certainly not Bree. Walt asked me, once, not to. Let people think I handled it, he said, and I understood. A man's pride is a fragile, particular thing, and I loved him enough to protect his. I have thought about that decision more times than I can count in the months since. At the time, it felt like kindness. Looking back, I wonder if it was actually the first quiet mistake, the moment I taught him that he could lean on me completely and never have to carry the weight of knowing it. Retirement is what finally cracked him open. For 30 years, Walt's identity had been built entirely on being needed. Crews called him, clients called him. Even at church, people asked his opinion on things that had nothing to do with construction, just because he had that kind of presence. Then, almost overnight, none of that existed anymore. He was just a man in a flannel jacket with nowhere he had to be at 7 in the morning. He tried to fill it. He reorganized the garage. He rebuilt the back steps that didn't need rebuilding. He labeled every drawer of screws and nails with a precision that would have made me proud if it hadn't also made me a little sad. But projects run out eventually, and by month 3, he was spending his mornings in the recliner with cable news on low volume, still in yesterday's shirt, complaining about his knees. I tried to loop him into our finances the way we always had. It backfired every time. If I asked whether we should move some savings into a higher yield account, he heard, "You think I don't understand money." If I mentioned a bill was due, he heard, "You can't be trusted to remember things anymore." Nothing I said landed the way I meant it. He'd become allergic to feeling managed. And the tragedy was, I wasn't trying to manage him. I was trying to include him. That's when Bree came back into the picture. She'd moved back to Maple Ridge after her divorce, into a rental about 15 minutes from us, and at first I was glad. A daughter reconnecting with her father. What's not to be glad about? She started coming for Sunday dinners. Then twice a week. Then almost daily. Always with some reason. Helping Dad organize his files. Helping Dad set up online banking. Helping Dad understand where the money's actually going. I want to be fair to her, even now. I don't think she set out to destroy anything. I think she was drowning quietly in her own life. I later learned she was carrying more than $26,000 across several credit cards, on top of a car she couldn't really afford. And somewhere in that drowning, controlling her father's finances started to feel like control over something, anything, in a life that otherwise felt like it was slipping through her fingers. But whatever her reasons, the effect was the same. Piece by piece, in small comments dropped over coffee, she rewrote how Walt saw me. "Dad, you built a whole company from nothing. You shouldn't have to ask Diane about your own money. Dad, she treats you like one of her old vendors, not like her husband. Dad, don't you think it's a little controlling how she handles everything?" I heard fragments of these conversations from the kitchen, and when I brought it up with Walt directly, he shut the conversation down every time with the same 6 words. "She's my daughter, Diane, enough." That sentence ended every discussion before it could really begin. Small amounts of money started disappearing from our joint household account. 300 here, 500 there, money I later learned Walt had quietly given Bree, never mentioning it to me. I wasn't watching for it. I trusted him. That's the part people forget about betrayal. It doesn't usually require someone to lie to your face. It just requires someone to stop telling you things. By the time that Tuesday morning arrived, the eggs, the decline, the phone call, I understand now that the marriage hadn't broken that morning. It had been breaking for months. The eggs just finally let me see the crack. I didn't go home after the grocery store. I sat in the parking lot until my hands stopped feeling cold, and then, almost without deciding to, I drove downtown instead, straight to the small brick office building across from the courthouse, where Margaret Chu had handled my late mother's estate years earlier. Meg looked up the moment I walked through her door, and whatever was on my face, she read it instantly. "Diane, sit. What happened?" I sat down across from her desk, and for a moment, I genuinely couldn't find words. Finally, I said the only sentence that felt true. I think my husband just let his daughter decide what kind of wife I'm allowed to be. Meg didn't rush to fill the silence, the way some people do. She just waited, patient, while I opened my bag and slid a small stack of folders across her desk. Bank statements, the deed to the house, retirement paperwork, the trust my parents had set up years before they passed. She went quiet as she read, that particular stillness she gets when she's concentrating, one finger tracing down each page. This checking account is joint, she said. Household expenses. This savings, also joint. Property taxes. Home repairs, mostly. She turned another page. But your pension deposits here. Individually held. And this brokerage account, solely yours. She looked up. And the house? Mine. I bought it 9 years before I met Walt. How much of his money went into it? None. He did some of the renovation work himself, but I paid for the materials, the permits, all of it. Meg nodded slowly and asked the question I'd been waiting for, almost dreading. Did he tell you he was restricting your access to anything? No. Did you agree to it? No. Did Bree have your permission to manage or influence any account in your name? Absolutely not. She took off her glasses, set them down carefully, and said something that has stayed with me since. Diane, they haven't frozen everything. They've frozen very little, actually. I don't think they realize that. I gave a short, humorless laugh. No, I don't think they do. Then she asked about the business, about 6 years ago, and I told her everything. The $98,000, the refinancing, the quiet years of never mentioning it to anyone. She listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers and good friends both know how to do. And when I finished, she asked one more question that I hadn't let myself ask out loud yet. Was any of that documented as a loan? No. Why not? Because he was my husband, I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I heard how thin they sounded in a lawyer's office, stripped of the love that had made them feel reasonable at the time. We spent almost 2 hours going through everything. By the end, Meg had a clear picture, and so, for the first time, did I. Walt and Bree had managed to interfere with exactly one account, the joint household checking. Everything else, my pension, my brokerage account, my parents' trust, the deed to my own house, remained completely untouched, because none of it had ever been theirs to touch in the first place. Meg allowed herself the smallest, driest smile. They've been guarding the bird feeder, Diane, while you still own the whole farm. Under any other circumstances, I might have laughed. Instead, I thought about Walt in that dark garage 6 years ago, saying he couldn't fix it, and I thought about how thoroughly I had fixed it for him, and how completely he now seemed to have forgotten that. Meg laid out a plan before I left her office. Revoke every voluntary authorization I'd given Walt over the years on my individual accounts. Update my estate documents. Change my healthcare proxy. Document every transfer going forward. And prepare, quietly, without filing anything yet, the paperwork for a legal separation, in case it came to that. Nothing dramatic today, she said. No confrontation, no announcements, just protection. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I know, she said. That's exactly why I'm telling you now, before you're tempted to. When I got home that afternoon, there were 3 flattened moving boxes leaning against the hallway wall, and more stacked in the guest room. Bree was standing beside them with a black marker in her hand, like we were preparing for a garage sale instead of the end of a marriage. We're just getting things ready, she said, almost cheerfully, in case you decide you want to leave. Walt was sitting in the den. He heard her. He didn't say a word, not in agreement, not in protest. Just silence, which somehow felt worse than either. That night, I lay awake beside him while he pretended to sleep, the red numbers on the clock crawling from 11 to 1 to almost 3. Our wedding photo sat on the dresser across the room. Walt thinner then, me with fewer lines around my eyes, both of us looking less like romance and more like relief. 2 people who'd found solid ground after their own separate storms. I stared at that photograph for a long time and asked myself honestly whether I was about to blow up my whole life over a carton of eggs. Then I remembered Bree's voice on the phone. Not even the words themselves anymore, just the certainty underneath them, and I understood something I'd been avoiding for months. The eggs hadn't caused any of this. They had simply, finally, shown me the door that had been standing open for a long time. Orchestrated screenplay continuation mapping remaining plot points toward target length. Orchestrated screenplay continuation mapping remaining plot points toward target length. I barely slept. Every time I drifted toward it, I heard that automated checkout voice. Insufficient funds, and then Breeze, layered right over it, patient and certain. By 6:30 Wednesday morning, I was already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee I wasn't really drinking. Walt came in a few minutes later, poured himself cereal, and glanced at me like it was any other morning. "Morning," he said. "Almost normal. Almost." I didn't answer right away. "You still upset?" he asked, like this was something that could be upset about, like I'd overreacted to a paint color. "Are you?" I asked back. He shrugged, the way he does when he wants a conversation to be smaller than it is. "I think you're making this bigger than it needs to be." "Bigger than what, Walt? The eggs?" "It wasn't about eggs." "No," I said, "it wasn't." He sighed, the exhausted sigh of a man who believes he's being reasonable, and everyone around him is being difficult. "Bree and I have just been talking about being careful, now that I'm not bringing in a paycheck." Careful. That word bothered me more than almost anything else he'd said. In 19 years, I had never once bought a designer bag or fine jewelry. Our vacations were long weekends at the lake, not overseas trips. I compared insurance rates every single year, out of habit, not necessity. If anyone in that marriage had ever been careful with money, it was me, and hearing that word aimed at me like an accusation nearly took my breath away. I didn't argue. I just said, "I'm going out," and he nodded without asking where, which hurt in a way I hadn't expected it to. Meg had already emailed me a checklist the night before. Bring identification. Bring the deed. Bring retirement statements. Don't discuss any of this with Walt. Don't respond to anything emotional. Simple. Methodical. Exactly what I needed. By 10 that morning, we were sitting inside the Maple Ridge branch of Heartland Credit Union, with a branch manager named Patricia Lane, a warm-faced woman in her 50s whom Meg had known professionally for years. Pat kept her voice low enough that no one nearby could overhear. "Mrs. Reyes," she said gently, "before we make any changes, I need every instruction to come directly from you, and only you." It took nearly 45 minutes. There was nothing dramatic about it, no raised voices, no alarms. Just signatures, initials, identification checked twice, more signatures. We revoked every authorization I had voluntarily given Walt over the years on the accounts that were legally mine alone. "These updates won't show immediately," Pat explained. "Processing usually finishes by tomorrow afternoon." "That's fine," Meg said, and I remember thinking, sitting there, that people imagine revenge as slammed doors and dramatic speeches. Real life is quieter than that. Real life is paperwork. Real life is signing your name over and over while some separate part of you registers, almost distantly, that your marriage is ending in a branch office with fluorescent lighting and a bowl of peppermints on the counter. Instead of going home afterward, I drove to my sister Wren's house in the next town over. She opened the door before I even knocked, took one look at my face and just said, "Oh, honey," and wrapped both arms around me. For the first time since Tuesday morning, I cried. Not loudly, just enough to let some of the pressure out. Over bowls of the vegetable soup she always seemed to have simmering, Wren shook her head. I never liked how often Bree was over there. I thought she was rebuilding things with her dad. "So did I admitted. "What do you actually want out of this?" she asked. I stared into my soup for a long moment. "I don't know," I said. And then, more honestly, "I keep hoping Walt wakes up." Wren smiled, sad and knowing. Sometimes people don't wake up until they've already lost something. Around noon, my phone buzzed. "Walt?" I remembered what Meg had said. "Don't answer, don't get pulled into anything emotional before the paperwork settles," and I let it ring out. A minute later, a text from Bree appeared on the screen. "Dad's confused. Stop trying to scare him." I locked the phone. Confused. Walt hadn't sounded confused on Tuesday. He'd sounded amused. Thursday morning felt strangely peaceful by comparison. Wren insisted we walk the trail around the reservoir near her house, and for almost an hour, neither of us mentioned lawyers or banks at all. We talked about her tomatoes refusing to grow, about nothing, about ordinary things, and it reminded me, gently, almost painfully, that life kept moving outside the wreckage of my marriage. Then, around 3:30 that afternoon, my phone rang. "Meg, they've processed everything," she said. "It's done." I thanked her, and before I'd even set the phone down, it lit up again. Walt, then Bree, then Walt again, a voicemail notification, a text, another call. It buzzed so steadily across Wren's kitchen table that she finally picked it up just to look at the screen, eyebrows rising. "Good Lord," she said. "That's 14 missed calls." By the time it slowed down, the number had climbed to 41. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Finally Wren asked, "What happened?" Before I could answer, Meg called again, her voice carrying the particular calm of someone who had expected exactly this. "This is exactly what I thought would happen," she said. "Walt tried to access one of your investment accounts online. He couldn't. Then he tried to use the home equity line you'd given him access to years ago. He couldn't reach that either. The bank simply confirmed his authorization had changed. Nothing more. No details, no explanations." My stomach was already tightening before she said the next part. "Diane, there's something else. One joint account slipped past our first review. The emergency savings," I said, already knowing. "Yes, a little over $52,000. It's still jointly accessible. If Bree convinces Walt to move that money before we get additional protection filed, they can legally do it." The kitchen suddenly felt colder than it had a minute earlier. Wren was watching my face and already knew, before I said a word, that it was bad. That evening, I watched the sun go down behind Wren's yard, my phone finally quiet in front of me. 41 missed calls, and not one of them, not a single voicemail, had said I'm sorry. Every message started the same way. "Linda, Diane, call me. We need to talk. Answer your phone." Demands. Every one of them, dressed up as concern. Sometime that night, I realized something I hadn't let myself say out loud yet. I wasn't trying to save my marriage anymore. I was trying to save myself. Just before I turned my phone off for the night, a text came in from Meg. "Be in my office at 8:30 tomorrow. We may still have one move left." I stared at that message for a long time before I finally fell asleep. _Meg was already on her second cup of coffee when Wren and I walked into her office Friday morning. I filed for a temporary restraining order on the disputed savings account at 7:30, she said. No preamble. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. So they can't touch it. Not without creating a much bigger legal problem for themselves. She slid a printed page across the desk. They already tried. I looked down at a transaction record from the previous evening, an attempted transfer of $47,500, status, declined, pending restriction. I closed my eyes. Walt had actually tried it. Whether it had been his idea or Bree had simply worn him down until he stopped resisting, I honestly didn't know which possibility hurt more. "I don't think this was ever about needing the money," Meg said gently. "No," I agreed. "It was about control. For the first time in 3 days, I fully believed that. By early afternoon, my phone had gone strangely quiet, which somehow worried me more than the 41 calls had. Around 1, Wren mentioned that Gary Nolan had called, an old friend of Walt's who still hosted his neighborhood cookout every November, wanting to confirm we were both still coming that Saturday. I nearly laughed. The last thing I need right now is a backyard full of Walt's friends. Wren gave me a small, apologetic look. "I already told him a little bit, why you sounded upset." "Wren, he already knew more than you'd think," she said simply. Saturday arrived cold and clear, and Gary's backyard looked the way it always did that time of year. Folding tables, portable heaters, a pot of chili on the counter, college football murmuring from a TV propped in the garage doorway. Ordinarily, I loved these gatherings. That year, every step toward the yard felt heavier than the last. People noticed me almost immediately. A few hugged me. A few gave uncomfortable half-smiles and looked away. It was obvious Bree had already been talking. I caught fragments as I passed. Heard she's leaving him. Something about hiding money. Poor guy just retired. And I kept smiling. Not because I felt anything close to happy, but because I refused to defend myself to people who hadn't bothered to ask me a single question. Walt arrived about half an hour later. Bree climbed out of the truck first, looking almost rehearsed in her confidence. Walt looked exhausted, unshaved, shoulders lower than I'd ever seen them. For one brief second our eyes met across the yard. He looked away first. We'd barely finished eating when Bree stood up beside the picnic table, holding a paper plate like a prop, and the whole yard slowly quieted around her, without her needing to raise her voice at all. "I just think families should know the truth," she said. "Bri," Gary started. "No, really." She turned toward me. "My dad worked his whole life. And now," she sighed, dramatic, practiced. "He's being abandoned because he retired." A few people nodded politely, uncertainly. "Diane froze him out financially. My father can't even access his own money." Someone near the drink table asked quietly, "Is that true?" I opened my mouth. Gary spoke first. "Wait," he said, genuinely confused. "What money?" Bree blinked. "What do you mean, what money?" "I thought Diane handled almost everything," Gary said, scratching the back of his neck. "I mean, after the business almost went under. The whole yard went still." "What business?" Bree said. Gary looked slowly toward Walt. "You never told her?" Walt's face lost what little color it had left. "I figured everybody knew," Gary said, almost apologetic now, and then, carefully, like he was laying out planks across unsteady ground. "When Walt nearly lost the company 6 years back, I helped him move equipment into storage while creditors were calling the shop every day." He looked toward me. "Diane negotiated with his suppliers. She worked out the payment plan with the IRS." A pause. "She refinanced her own house to cover it." Bree stared at her father. "Dad." Walt said nothing. Gary wasn't finished. "And when Walt needed that knee surgery 2 years ago, insurance didn't cover the deductible. Diane paid it. Out of her own account." He looked around at the small, stunned circle of neighbors. "You know what's saddest about all this?" No one answered. He looked directly at Walt. "You spent years letting people think you rebuilt everything yourself." His voice softened. "The truth is, your wife never once made you feel small for needing help." The silence that followed felt like it lasted a full minute. Bree looked at me differently now, not with hostility anymore, but something closer to panic. Watching the story she'd built for months collapse in real time in front of everyone who mattered to her father. "So, she's still abandoning him," she tried, weaker now. "No," said a voice behind us. "Meg." I hadn't even realized she'd arrived. She crossed the yard calmly, a folder in hand, and handed it to me before turning politely to the gathered group. "For everyone's peace of mind," she said, professional and even, "a temporary hearing is scheduled for next week. Not about dividing property." She looked directly at Walt, only to determine whether financial authority was improperly exercised. Bree stiffened. Walt closed his eyes. For the first time since any of this began, he looked genuinely ashamed. Not embarrassed, not caught. Ashamed. And there is a difference between those two things that I don't think I fully understood until I watched it happen on his face. Bree reached for his arm. "Dad." He stepped away from her. Just one step. But everyone noticed. I noticed most of all. As people slowly drifted back into smaller conversations, Walt finally crossed the yard toward me and stopped about 6 feet away. Close enough to talk, too far to touch. "I didn't think," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I know." "No," he shook his head. "I really didn't think," Bree said. He couldn't finish the sentence, and in that unfinished sentence, I understood something that broke my heart more than anything else that whole week. My husband hadn't just believed a set of lies. He had needed them to be true, because believing them let him stop feeling guilty about everything I had quietly sacrificed for him over the years. Meg touched my elbow gently. "We should go." I nodded. As we walked toward the car, she said, "This Saturday isn't the hearing." "I know. But it may be the day your husband finally heard the truth." I looked back once. Walt was standing alone near the fence line, Bree talking rapidly beside him, but for the first time in months, he wasn't listening to her. He was somewhere else entirely, alone, finally, with his own conscience. Orchestrated script completion toward 7,000-word target. Orchestrated script completion toward 7,000-word target. The hearing was set for the following Thursday. 6 days. Not 6 months, not 6 years. Just 6 days that somehow felt longer than the previous 19 years combined. Meg warned me not to expect anything dramatic. "This isn't a divorce trial," she reminded me as we walked through security at the county courthouse. "It's a temporary hearing. The judge isn't deciding who gets what today." "I know. Today is one question only. Did someone cross a legal line?" That sounded simple. It wasn't, not really. Not when the someone was a man I'd shared a bed with for 19 years. Courtrooms are quieter than television makes them out to be. No music, no shouting, mostly the shuffle of papers and doors opening and closing, and the occasional cough from somewhere in the back rows. When our case was called, Walt was already seated at the opposite table, Bree beside him, looking tired rather than defiant, avoiding my eyes for the first time since any of this started. Walt's blazer hung loose on him. He'd lost weight, or maybe guilt just makes a person look smaller than they are. Judge Carol Whitfield entered, late 60s, composed, the kind of face that had clearly heard every version of every family story there was to hear. Both attorneys were greeted politely. Then the hearing began. Meg didn't raise her voice once. She didn't need to. She simply laid out a timeline, exhibit by exhibit. Mrs. Reyes voluntarily granted her husband access to certain accounts over many years. "For convenience," she said, placing a document before the clerk. These authorizations were based on trust. A pause. Not ownership. Judge Whitfield nodded slightly, and Meg continued. The household account altered without notice. The debit card declined in front of a store full of strangers. The text message demanding permission before another dollar could be spent. She played one voicemail, brief and unembellished. Walt's voice, tight and impatient. "Diane, call me." Then Bree's, "Stop making this harder than it has to be." The courtroom went very still. Walt's attorney stood, visibly uncomfortable with his own argument. "Your Honor, this is a misunderstanding between spouses regarding household budgeting after retirement. There was never any intent to deprive Mrs. Reyes of financial security." Judge Whitfield looked past him, straight at Walt. "Mr. Reyes, please stand." He did. "When your business experienced severe difficulty 6 years ago," she said, "did your wife assist you financially?" A long pause. "Yes." "Were those funds gifts?" "Yes." "Did she require your permission before helping you?" "No." "When your tax obligations became overdue, did your wife negotiate the payment arrangements?" "Yes." "Did she ask you to repay her?" "No." The judge folded her hands and let the silence stretch a moment, before she asked the question that seemed to hang over the entire room. "Mr. Reyes, did your wife ever require your permission before paying your business debts, protecting your credit, or preserving your home?" Nobody moved. Walt opened his mouth twice before anything came out. "No," he finally said. "Thank you," the judge said. "You may sit." Bree leaned toward her father's attorney and whispered something, frustration plain on her face, then raised her hand slightly. "Your Honor." "Ms. Reyes," the judge said, without even looking up, "you are not a party to this action. You'll remain silent unless directly addressed." Bree sat back, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely nervous. Pat from the credit union testified briefly by video. The revocations had come directly and verifiably from me. Standard procedure had been followed. No confidential information about the accounts had ever been shared with Walt. "Did the bank freeze any of Mr. Reyes's personal accounts?" the judge asked. "No, Your Honor." "Did Mrs. Reyes take anything belonging solely to her husband?" "No." "So every change involved only accounts legally owned by Mrs. Reyes, or authorizations she chose, on her own, to revoke." "Correct." Then Meg introduced the final document, the attempted transfer of $47,500 from the joint emergency account, time-stamped the day after my card had been declined. "Were you aware this transfer was attempted?" the judge asked Walt. "Yes." "Whose idea was it?" Another pause, heavier than the last. Bree suggested moving the money. "Did you question why?" His voice cracked slightly. "No." The judge leaned back. "I appreciate the honesty." Then more formally, "This court is not determining the ultimate division of marital assets today. Today's purpose is narrower." She signed several pages in succession. "Mrs. Reyes's exclusive authority over her separate property is restored, effective immediately. The disputed joint savings account will remain protected pending further proceedings. Neither party will interfere with the other's separately owned assets until this matter is fully resolved." She looked at Walt, then at me. Marriage requires trust, she said. So does financial partnership. Court adjourned. No cameras waiting outside, no reporters. Just ordinary people filing down the courthouse steps into an ordinary Thursday. Walt caught up with me in the parking area, Bree hanging back several yards. He looked up at me, eyes red. "I've been trying to remember," he said quietly. "The last time Bree and I talked about money without your name coming into it." I didn't answer, because I already knew the answer, and so did he. "I think somewhere along the way," he went on, voice breaking, "I stopped seeing what was actually happening. I believed her. It didn't erase anything, but I believed that he believed it, and somehow that was its own small, sad kind of truth." Meg touched my arm gently. "We should go." As we reached the parking garage, my phone buzzed once. A new voicemail from Walt. I almost deleted it without listening. Instead, I pressed play. There were several seconds of just breathing, and then, quietly, "I never meant to humiliate you, Diane." The apology I'd wanted for over a week had finally come. It didn't feel like victory. It just felt like standing at the edge of everything that had already been lost, finally able to see the whole shape of it. 3 months later, the divorce was finalized. People imagine the end of a marriage as one dramatic moment. A slammed door, a signed decree, someone walking away without looking back. The truth is much quieter than that. The paperwork arrived in a plain envelope on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Meg called to confirm everything had been filed. "Is that it?" I asked. "That's it," she said. I thanked her, hung up, and sat for a long while at my new kitchen table. Not the Maple Ridge house anymore, which had already sold, but a small 2-bedroom townhouse 15 minutes from Wren's place. Enough space for one person, no more, no less. It still smelled faintly of fresh paint. My mother's quilt was folded over the back of the couch. My first husband's old rocking chair sat by the window. Some things had earned the right to stay with me. Others, finally, had been packed away. The settlement surprised a few relatives, not because I'd won anything spectacular, but because I hadn't tried to. Meg had asked me once, weeks earlier, what outcome I actually wanted, and I'd sat with the question a long time before answering honestly. I want my life back, not revenge, just peace. The court recognized what had always been true. The house stayed mine, because I'd bought it years before the marriage began. My parents' trust stayed untouched. My retirement stayed mine. The joint savings was divided fairly. Walt kept his truck, his tools, his own retirement funds. Nobody walked away rich. Nobody walked away ruined. It wasn't a victory so much as a boundary, one that never should have needed defending in the first place. About a month later, Wren talked me into volunteering at the County Senior Resource Center, teaching a budgeting class. "You did this professionally for 29 years, she pointed out. "Might as well use it." So every other Wednesday morning, I sit in a small community room with a dozen retirees, some recently widowed, some navigating adult children who've inserted themselves into their finances, some just trying to avoid getting scammed. One morning, a woman named Denise raised her hand and asked, quietly, "What if the person controlling your money is family?" The room went very still. "The first thing you do," I told her, "is tell someone you trust." She nodded slowly, then whispered, almost to herself, "I wish I'd done that sooner." Afterward, she hugged me and said, "I thought I was the only one." I realized then that my story had never been unique at all. That was the part that broke my heart a little, and also, oddly, the part that helped me heal. I heard about Bree through mutual friends, eventually. The credit card debt finally caught up with her once Walt stopped quietly covering the gaps, and she filed for bankruptcy not long after. I thought hearing that would feel like something. It didn't. Mostly I just felt tired for her. She'd spent so much energy trying to control money that had never belonged to her, and in the end, she'd lost something far more valuable, her relationship with her father, who, by every account I heard, had grown quiet and withdrawn in the small apartment he'd rented on the other side of town. One Saturday morning in early spring, my phone rang. "Walt." I stared at his name for almost a full minute before answering. "Hi," he said. His voice sounded different, not defeated exactly, just softer. "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything." A pause. "But would you have coffee with me?" I almost said no. Instead, I heard myself say, When? We met at a small coffee shop across town, the kind with creaky wood floors and homemade cinnamon rolls. He was already there when I arrived, standing, a little nervous, smiling in a way I hadn't seen from him in a long time. Not his old easy grin, something more careful than that. We ordered coffee and nothing else. For a while we just watched people come and go. I've replayed that morning at the store 1,000 times, he finally said. I wish I could erase it, I told him. You can't. I know. He turned his mug slowly between his hands. You know what finally got through to me? It wasn't even Bree in the end. I made my own choices. I think I kept blaming her because it hurt less than blaming myself. He was quiet for a moment. When I retired, I stopped feeling useful. And you were still solving problems, still had a plan for everything. I'd spent my whole life fixing things, and suddenly I couldn't fix anything, not even myself. I think I confused being in control with being respected. That sentence stayed with me, because I knew exactly when that confusion had started. Not when Bree moved back, not even at retirement, but long before, in 100 small decisions, until one day he'd simply forgotten that a marriage was never supposed to be a scoreboard. It was never about the eggs, I said quietly. I know, he said. It was about the moment you stopped seeing me as your partner. He looked down at the table. I did that, not you. Another long silence. Then he looked back up. I'm sorry, Diane. This time, I believed him completely. But forgiveness isn't the same thing as rebuilding. Some bridges can be repaired. Others simply become markers of where not to cross again. I reached across the table, not to hold his hand, just to touch it briefly. I hope you find peace, Walt. His eyes filled. You too. I stood first. He didn't ask me to stay, and he didn't ask for another chance, and somehow that told me everything, that he'd finally understood something true. Respect can't be demanded back once it's spent. Trust can't be controlled into existing. And love, in the end, can't survive in a place where permission has replaced partnership. A few weeks after that, I stopped by that same Fairview market. I wasn't thinking about any of it, really. I just needed groceries. Eggs, coffee, bread. I noticed, almost fondly, that the eggs had gone up another 20 cents. I put the carton in my cart anyway. At the register, I slid my card through. Approved. The cashier handed me my receipt with an easy, ordinary smile. Have a good one, she said. You too, I told her, and walked out into the sunlight carrying one small bag of groceries, and it felt, for the first time in a long time, like the simplest thing in the world. Looking back now, I understand that morning at the checkout line didn't end my marriage. It only revealed what had already been ending, slowly, for a long time before that. Sometimes life doesn't change because of one enormous moment. Sometimes it changes because an ordinary Tuesday finally shows you the truth you'd been quietly avoiding for months. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect, I hope you chose yourself, or that one day you will. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope our paths cross again soon.